What is a panic attack? In layman's terms, and just in general, one of the ways that we often will think about a panic attack is it's basically a really quick burst onset of some very intense anxiety. And there's a physiological part of a panic attack that happens where it's more than just getting into a cognitive spiral. So what happens is you'll have this burst of anxiety that you feel, and then it generally then manifests itself physiologically as, like, you might get sweaty palms, you might feel lightheaded, you might hyperventilate, you might become incredibly nauseous, have severe abdominal pains, a really bad headache, you might feel tingly in your fingers. Another way that it may physiologically show up is you may just completely shut down and become catatonic. So there's a common misconception that all panic attacks are outward as just these intense manifestations of hyperventilation and screaming and yelling and all these things. But they also can manifest themselves as a person becoming catatonic and basically freezing and freaking out internally, but not really able to get it out. Okay, so those are kind of the two manifestations of it. It's not like you fall into one category or another. It just depends on the person and the context and all of that fun stuff. You can have a panic attack without having a panic disorder. You can have panic attacks without having an anxiety disorder. Just because you have a panic attack doesn't mean that you are necessarily diagnosable with something. It may just mean that you had a panic attack. And the way that people often describe panic attacks is that they are very similar to feeling like you are going to die. So sometimes the hyperventilation is so horrible, or the spiral is so bad, or the physiological symptoms are so distressing that a person feels like they're going to drop dead because it's so unbelievably overwhelming. In part because of the way that the brain is just being flooded in that moment. Your prefrontal cortex goes offline. You're in your reptilian brain, and it can be just so horribly distressing. And from a relational standpoint, it leaves the people who are sitting by the person who's having the panic attack also feeling really helpless and overwhelmed, because it can be really scary to bear witness to a panic attack. Just to differentiate really quickly, there's panic disorder is something that you can be diagnosed with, and panic disorder is generally diagnosable with people who have recurrent unexpected panic attacks. Sometimes people will expect panic attacks to come on, and that's actually what can make them happen. But if you have unexpected panic attacks that come out of nowhere, that's generally the marker of a person who potentially has panic disorder. So I just want to also make sure that that is out of the way. The way that panic attacks work is they happen in the context of a positive feedback loop. And so what a positive feedback loop is when a sequence of events happens, or something happens, and what it does is it causes a snowball effect, so that the response to that then affects what started the first sequence, and then that causes that sequence to then compound itself and go into a different sequence, which then causes this to become even worse, which then causes this to be even worse, which causes this to be even worse, and soon you're out here and stuff's crazy. So you think about it as a snowball effect. It starts very small, and then you roll it down the hill. When you roll a snowball down the hill, it collects more snow. Collecting more snow gives it more momentum, gives it more speed to go down the hill, which makes it pick up more snow, which then makes the snowball much bigger by the time that it gets down to the bottom of the hill. Okay, so positive feedback loops are everywhere, and we see feedback loops as a way to engage in a level of behavioral reinforcement. So when we've talked about reinforcement and conditioning before, we've talked about this a bit too. So an example of this would be, let's say you have a child who you want to clean their room. So when the child cleans their room, let's say you then reward them with some ice cream. Rewarding them with the ice cream then causes the child to want to clean their room again because they've been rewarded, which means there could be more ice cream. More ice cream means I'm going to continue to do my chores, on and on. Being paid for the work that you do in your job. is another example of a positive feedback loop. I work more, I get paid more to work more, so I want to work more because then I can make more money. I make more money, I can spend more, which then makes me want to continue to go to work so I can have more money to spend more money. Positive feedback. Panic attacks generally they can last anywhere from 2 minutes to 20 minutes-ish. It really depends on how bad it is, how horrible the spiral is, and whether there's anything there that can help stop it. So here's the way that this generally works with panic attacks. Person will experience something that makes them anxious. So they have anxiety. All right, so you might feel that somewhere in your body. You feel anxious, or you're at generally an arousable state. So I'm going to put also like passive arousal. And then what happens is there is something that will then trigger an uptick in anxiety. So I'm already in in a state of arousal, and then all of a sudden something triggers it. It could be anything. It could be a smell. It could be seeing something happen. It could also be anticipation of a panic attack. So I feel the anxiety of having a panic attack. I then worry that I'm going to have the panic attack. And then all of a sudden I notice that there's data to suggest that I may have it, meaning I am looking at my hands are starting to clam up. I'm starting to spiral. I'm starting to spin out of control cognitively. And then I panic. When I panic, it starts to put me further into arousal. I may then attend to worrying that it's going to get worse. I'm going to then look for more data that suggests I'm having the panic attack, and I'm going to continue to panic, and it's a really nasty positive feedback loop. Okay, so you see how that happens? So I'm anxious, I'm looking, and then what I'm doing is looking for data that basically confirms this experience, and then we can actually induce a panic attack because we have the physiological symptoms. So I'm going to simplify this a little bit by saying worry and anxiety, physiological symptoms, and then so what happens is you feel the worry, you feel the anxiety, you then start to feel physiological symptoms of it. So physiological symptoms being, again, sweating, trembling, palpitation, shortness of breath. You feel it coming on. You have a internal freak out, and then what happens is we engage in meaning that basically says something like, oh shit, here it comes, I'm having a panic attack. And then we start to attend to those thoughts, those intrusive thoughts. That cognition then goes to a space where we start to attend more to the worry, anxiety. We attend more to the physiological symptoms. We get into the cognitive spiral. All of a sudden, I'm panicking. I start to hyperventilate. I start to sweat. I start to freak out. My brain shuts down. And then I've lost all function. Okay? So we will start to, in this process, you have a choice when you start to feel the physiological symptoms coming on, which is you have confirmation and you have I'm going to call it counterpoints. Okay, so one of the key spots when we're feeling the onset of a panic attack coming on is what we cognitively attend to. So if you have that thought in there of, oh shit, I'm freaking out, I'm starting to panic, or you're starting to worry about something in particular, like maybe you're worrying about failing, or you're worrying that everybody's watching you, or you're worried that nobody cares, or that you've embarrassed everybody, whatever it might be, then what we start to do is we attend to this confirmation. We will look for data that suggests that this is happening. Sometimes the physiological symptoms present themselves as that data. So I'm feeling a panic attack coming on. I'm feeling really worried that I just failed. I'm going to start looking for confirmation that that has happened. So I noticed that somebody looked away. I noticed nobody's paying attention. I noticed that my view count's going down. I noticed that people don't seem to be paying attention to me. Then all of a sudden, these physiological symptoms start to go on. You get into the anxiety spiral because of the confirmation, and then we're back into a panic attack. So it's this nasty cognitive spiral. And so what happens sometimes in the context of a panic attack is we could say, well, I'm going to look at counterpoints. So maybe I'm worried that I'm failing, and I may look for confirmation for the fact that I'm failing, but then I could also look at counterpoint to the fact that I'm failing. I might say, so let's say if I was worried I was going to have a panic attack because I'm really screwing this lecture up right now, I could look for confirmation, or I could look for a counterpoint. A counterpoint being, you guys are hanging around and you guys are still talking to me and you guys are watching. And so there's some reinforcement for that might suggest to me, wait a minute, my worry may potentially be unfounded, or I may need to attend to my emotional experience for a second, but it may not be that the meaning I'm making out of this is true, because there's a counterpoint to attend to. But what can happen sometimes is if we look at a counterpoint and we don't take a second to recognize that it's a counterpoint, then all of a sudden what could happen is we may start to become more anxious because we're expecting everybody else to be paying attention, and we're expecting the panic attack to happen. And if we don't start seeing data that suggests it's going to happen, you may get anxious and think, oh my God, it's because I'm not noticing it. And that may then increase the anxiety, send you into a cognitive spiral, and then we're back into the positive feedback loop. And then what happens is, as those physiological symptoms go up, as the anxiety starts to go up, it starts to compound itself to a point where literally our brain freaks out so much that it decides, you know what, I got to shut it down. Dr. Mick, I got to shut it down, and what I'm going to do is basically make you blank out or freak out or tremble, because then at the very least you have to attend to that, and then I don't have to get sucked into this cognitive spiral anymore. And what we want to do when thinking about intercepting this is figuring out how to block that spiral from continuing. Right, but I want to stop for a second and ask you guys if this makes sense right now as I'm talking about this. As we think about the wormhole of anxiety. So we go here, to here, to here, to here, into panic. By the way, the trigger itself, so if I say, I know it's a little bit messy, but don't worry about it. The trigger can be anything, okay? So the trigger that basically pushes you forward from the state of arousal into a panic attack could be anything like a social stress. It could be a nodal event. It could be an accumulation of stress. It could be the thought of having a panic attack. Some people are really distressed by the idea that they could have a panic attack, and that actually causes a panic attack to happen. And it could be chronic condition. It could be side effects from a medication that you're taking. It could be caffeine. By the way, caffeine heightens arousal. This is why it's really important, by the way, for all of us to be attending at any given point to how much of an arousal state you are currently in, because if you're a person who has a propensity for panic attacks, you ought to know if you're in a heightened state of arousal at any given point in time. Worrying about a panic attack can cause them. Yeah. So here's another way. I'm going to give you a couple examples of the way that this feedback loop can work. Anxiety hits, okay? You have two. This is where we're going to get into some branching here. So you have anxiety. So then you have two options that happen. You might expect panic, or you might, I know I have horrible handwriting, I'm sorry. So you might expect a panic attack, or you might expect the anxiety to go to extinction. Okay, so we're going to entertain both of these here for a second. If you expect a panic attack to happen, then there's two things that can happen. You might notice the physiological symptoms that suggest that you're having one, or you may not experience panic symptoms. And here's where the nastiness of this comes in, okay? The operative word here is the expectation. And I know you guys have been watching me for a long time, so you know how much I spend time talking about the connection of expectation and experience. What we're talking about is experience here. If you start to have the physiological symptoms and you're expecting that, and you panic, in a weird way, the panic reinforces the expectation that you were going to panic. And so you will panic because your brain was expecting it to happen, and it's in a really backwards kind of way more comfortable for your brain to have the panic attack because it was expecting that it was going to happen. So you may hate it and it may be awful, but at least you got confirmation for your expectation of the panic attack. Or what can happen is if you don't experience the panic, then what might happen is your experience all of a sudden doesn't align. You might be anxious because if you're not anxious, you feel weird because you don't know how to not be anxious in this moment. So maybe you were expecting a panic attack and you didn't have a panic attack, and you start to freak out because you're not having a panic attack, or your brain goes into some level of aversive arousal, and then all of a sudden you get anxious because your expectation hasn't been confirmed, in which case, whoop, we're going back to panic. And so then that nasty spiral starts. So conversely, if you go into this and you start to have some anxiety and you expect that the anxiety is going to go away, and you experience, I'm going to go down here, and let's say that you then experience the physiological symptoms, your anxiety may go up because you weren't expecting to become anxious, you weren't expecting to panic, and now all of a sudden you're starting to freak out because you're starting to have a panic attack. Your anxiety goes up and you panic. Okay? Or your other option in this is you might expect extinction and then there's no experience of it. And so take a guess really quick what you think is going to happen. You feel anxious, you expect the anxiety to go away, and the anxiety does start to go away over time. Then what's going to happen is your experience and your expectations aligned, and you're going to extinguish the panic attack. It will go away. So our goal in the context of a panic attack is to do our best to extinguish it, is to try to figure out one of two things. Like the point of entry here, I think the two most important arrows when we're talking about how we figure out how to navigate a panic attack, and what I'm always thinking about if I'm working with people who have panic attacks, is this arrow and this arrow. And so we want to try to cut, I would say merely these two arrows here and here are the 2 points that ideally you could intervene on and regulate and will probably have the most impact. Now, that is not necessarily supported by any research, okay? That's mostly anecdotal from where in my own experience as a therapist I have found that you have the most ability a priori to the panic attack to be able to extinguish it. The idea here is you experience the anxiety and then you want to move to a space where you potentially have built in an expectation that the anxiety itself will extinguish. Now, it's more to it. It's not just going to happen because you expect it. There's more to it than that. But our goal is to try to get to a point where you can expect that at some point this will go away. This will extinguish. Or conversely, if you can't get there and there's still the expectation of the panic attack, what we want to do is, if the person is starting to have the physiological symptoms of the panic attack, we want to be able to move that to kind of like an expectation that that's going to happen, and basically confirmation, be like, okay, I knew this was going to happen. Let me slow myself down here. Like, my expectation was confirmed, but let me try to slow it down. I mean, I might make another argument that this is a really useful arrow to break it. I mean, all of these arrows are useful. But like, if you don't experience the symptoms, to try to break this so that the person doesn't experience the anxiety of not experiencing the symptoms. So basically trying to reformulate their expectation. But ultimately, this is the arrow that I really want to get in at. So how do we do that? So if we're experiencing anxiety or arousal, if we're in this part of the loop, now is where I'm going to start talking about what do we do. So if you're experiencing, if you're in an arousal state, one of the most important things that you can do is attend to it. So right now, if you feel inclined, you do not have to do this. This is just if you feel inclined. Take a second and ask yourself, how excitable am I right now? What kind of state of arousal am I in? Am I sensitive right now to potential inputs? Or do I feel pretty resilient right now to potential inputs? I can tell you that as I'm talking right now, I feel pretty chill. I don't feel like I'm in too heightened state of an arousal. So there's not really much that's going to send me into a anxiety spiral right now, because I'm generally feeling pretty good. If you happen to be sitting there thinking, oh my God, I'm in a really heightened state of arousal, that's okay. It's not better or worse to be in a heightened state of arousal or not. It's just really important to be able to attend to where we are, because if you can attend to what your current state of arousal is, you will recognize how prone you are to potentially being triggered. And it's generally how triggered you're going to be by something that's unexpected. So think about that for a second. If something unexpected, if something didn't go to plan right now, what would you do? Would you freak out? So that's what I mean by attend to it. Be curious about it. So generally what I say to people when they're experiencing anxiety or they're in an aroused state, I will say, okay, let's be curious about that right now. Let's ask ourselves some questions about what's happening. Why do you think you're in an arousal state? Why do you think that and why question? I don't like why questions because why implies judgment, but what's it like right now to be a 7 out of 10? What's it like right now to be a 2 out of 10? What do you think anxiety is trying to protect? What do you think anxiety is trying to plan for? What role is it currently taking? Yeah, Gerbo, when you ask somebody a question, if you ask a person why generally has to be met with some level of justification. So people tend to hear implied judgment in why questions. All right. So being curious about our emotional experience is really a big deal. And having some level of understanding of context for our emotional state is some real higher order stuff. So my state of arousal right now, if I think about me being curious about it, like I'm pretty low. And I think that's because I'm comfortable. It's because I know what I'm talking about. And it's because I really love sharing this stuff with you guys. And so I'm not in a state of really being particularly panicky about me doing this lecture. If this was something I didn't know anything about, my state of arousal would be much higher. Now, the next one's a little bit tough, but if we think about the flow of operations here, the trigger itself, what do? It's important to realize that it's likely unexpected, and it's important to try to see it if we can. So notice the physiological change that happens. So if you get triggered, if you see the trigger, recognize that the reason it's triggering is likely because it was unexpected. It's important to be able to see it, and then it's important to recognize that it has caused a change in your physiological state and to know what that change is. If you can have some prior knowledge of what your trigger is so that you know all of these things, where like you could sit here and you could say to me right now that you could check the boxes on knowing what happens when a trigger comes about, that's likely going to be really helpful for you. But it's important to realize the reason that I say this one, that it's likely unexpected, is that if you can expect it to be unexpected and really get into that, then when it happens unexpectedly, you expected that that's how it was going to happen. I know that sounds a little bit cuckoo, but what you're trying to do ultimately in thinking about navigating panic attacks is shifting your expectation of what's going to happen. And so if you can expect that a trigger will be unexpected, that's important, because sometimes what people do is they get so wrapped up in trying to expect the trigger to happen, but they don't know when it will happen, that can actually start to cause a little feedback loop even with this arousal, where the arousal state starts to go up because you're constantly being vigilant about trying to see the trigger. So if I expect that I will be able to know when the trigger is going to happen, you've already set yourself up for, if the trigger happens unexpectedly, you're going to spiral. But that's the thing, is expect it to be unexpected. Expect that you're going to be caught off guard by it in terms of triggers. But also you can expect, this is where this all comes together here to some extent, because if you can be monitoring your arousal state, you might also realize that you have a higher likelihood of being triggered. So you might be able to build an expectation that there's a chance, just a chance, that I could potentially have something happen that's going to send me into a spiral. So these two things work really nicely. You want to basically create alternative positive feedback loops. All right, but what happens if you get to the point where you have the let's say you get to the point where the physiological response starts to happen. Your palms start sweating. You feel it coming on. One of the most key things that you can possibly do is acknowledge that it's happening. It's happening. I am getting anxious. The symptoms are starting. It's here. And I mean, I know it's hard to say in the moment, but if you can say like it's okay that it's here, that's a big one. That's real higher order shit. But really what's important is to acknowledge it. And then to understand and to realize that at that point you are likely going to experience fear. And if you get afraid when you start to have the physiological response, that can send you into a spiral. So it's really important to cut into that through self-talk. So, okay, I'm starting to have a panic attack. Yes. Right? I haven't successfully managed to navigate these first 2 points. I haven't successfully, I'm still having the onset of the physiological response. I'm still starting to panic. Maybe I couldn't catch the trigger fast enough and it still caught me off guard to a point where this is starting. And the physiological response starts. Acknowledging it and knowing that that's going to cause fear, and knowing that that fear is completely normal, that's understandable because you feel like you're going to die. And this is why trying to navigate, if you are a person who experiences a lot of panic attacks, going at it alone is really tough, because ultimately these things are really hard to do in isolation, especially the physiological response. That's where having somebody around who can help ground you is super important. Notice the change. And if you start to feel it coming on, look for safety. Now, I will say, I am conflicted about the next part that I'm going to say, and I'll explain why I'm conflicted about it. Some people would tell you that you should look for safety here, that when you enter a given situation, you should be looking for your bailout, and you should be looking for your plan for what to do. I think that can be helpful, but I have also had some experiences where when people have a plan for the panic attack, it actually creates the expectation that the panic attack is going to happen. So then they start to engage in a really significant amount of hypervigilance, and that can induce the panic attack because then you're expecting it to happen. So I'm conflicted about that. It helps for some people, it doesn't for others, but I think regardless, when you feel the physiological response coming on and you know what that physiological response is, at that point, then you might want to look for safety. And at that point, maybe you have just an overarching game plan that you've worked out with a therapist of kind of knowing what your roadmap is if this goes off the rails. That's where then when we move through the physiological response, the next step that I said to you guys is your cognition, or basically the meaning that you make out of what's happening. And that's where we want to, as best we can, engage. Now, this is really hard. This is something that you really have to work towards, engaging in alternative self-talk. Because if you start going down the slope of, oh God, it's here, I'm panicking, I'm screwed, I'm screwed, I'm screwed, I'm screwed, I'm screwed, you're not helping yourself out. If you can get into a space where you're saying something like, I know what this means. It's okay for me to be afraid. I matter. Calm people live, tense people die. I know I say that a lot. I'm having a physiological response, and it's because I'm scared. I feel that. I matter. I will be okay. But generally here, if you're intervening here is really hard because you're already having the physiological response. So by the time I'm here, this is just what you would want to work to try to be mindful of that when it happens. So how do we cut these off? what do you do? Let's start with when you or the person you know is having the actual panic attack. At this point, what we want to do is disrupt the feedback loop. So the way that we do this is through generally what's called grounding. So as a person starts to get into this really, really, really nasty spiral, we want to try to break that cycle. The way that we break that cycle is to try to pull somebody out of their head and into the present. So if I was going to draw, which I'm going to do, okay, so this is a person who's currently having a panic attack. This is their head. The way that the panic attack works cognitively is it works as a really nasty spiral that goes inward. And so what we want to do is try to catch this loop and pull that person out of that spiral. So it's putting a big giant disruption on that and pulling them out into the present. What's also happening is at this point in time, this person's sympathetic nervous system is starting to fire. So they're becoming increasingly more aroused. And so what we also want to do is engage their parasympathetic nervous system as best we can. And so the way that we do that is through grounding or selective focus. Now, ideally, would we be able to do this on our own? Yes. When you're first starting out, you're probably going to need some help. So for those of you that have been around a person who has had or is having a panic attack, what you basically want to do is catch their attention as best you can and pull them into the present moment, because the anxiety spiral could either be stuck in the future or in the past. And so one of the ways that we can ground somebody is through touch. So if a person's okay with it, and now at times if a person's really starting to panic, asking their permission to ground them through touch may be hard, because they're not even going to be able to answer that question because their ability to even hear you is offline. But touching a person's leg, touching their face, like if you could kind of grab somebody's, not aggressively, but if you can kind of softly grab somebody's face, and eye contact is a big one. So if you can grab eye contact, relationally, that's a way to pull ourselves into the present moment. For some people, it's really hard to engage in eye contact because of the present. You might also ground by using what I've done before on stream, vocal pacing. So you match their pace and then you slowly work your way down to being slower, or truly just be with them. So, coder, at some point, you're probably going to want to be using this kind of pacing with the person. And while you're doing all of these things, you're using a lot of empathy. So at first, you're going to be starting really fast. You're going to be working with them, and you might touch them and say, okay, yeah, I hear you. I get it. Yes, this is really scary. I'm right here. I'm here with you. I'm here with you. You're okay. Don't say calm down. Don't ever say calm down. You do not want to make demands of a person who is having a panic attack. That, if there's nothing else you remember today, remember that. The worst thing you can do to a person who is having a panic attack is make demands, because their brain is shutting down. It's not capable. So you want to empathize with what it is that's happening for them. I'm here with you. You're okay. I'm with you. Will be okay is not necessarily helpful, but you are okay can be. It can be It can be affirming. And a person might say, no, I'm not, no, I'm not, no, I'm not. And if they do, you go, okay, yeah, I hear you. You don't feel okay. This is really scary. I'm right here with you. I'm here. Look at me. Hey, pay attention to me. Feel my hand. You feel my hand? I'm right here. I'm right here with you. Right here with you. It's okay. I know that this is really scary. I'm right here with you. And then as you're doing it, again, you're slowing your voice down. And so you're still saying, I'm right here. I know that this is really scary. I see you. Hey, keep looking at me. Keep looking at me. Feel my hand. Pay attention to my hand. Do you feel my hand? You feel my hand? Good. You feel my hand? Yeah, pay attention to my hand. Feel me squeeze. You can squeeze and release as a way to kind of keep the novelty of the touch going. But I'm right here with you. I'm here. Hey, look at me. It's me. It's me. It's Ryan. I'm right here. I'm with you. I'm here. It's okay. You're okay. Keep breathing. Breathe. And as they start to slow down, you can start to make some very small bite-sized demands, such as breathe. I'm right here with you. Hey, breathe with me. In through your nose. Hold it with me. I know it's hard. I know it's hard. Right? You kind of you match their pacing if they start to get. I know it's hard. I know it's hard. Hey, breathe with me. Breathe with me. Take a breath. Okay, and we're going to go out through our mouth. I'm right here with you. I'm right here. You feel my hand? Feel my hand? Good. Yeah, my hand's on your leg. Okay, I'm going to move my hand over to your knee. I want you to pay attention to me. I want you to just feel my hand. I'm right here with you. So notice how even in that I'm doing these 4 things. There's touch, there's eye contact, there's vocal pacing, and there's staying present by basically naming that I'm present and then using empathy as the bridge for all of that and recognizing that experience. I'm not ever making a demand to that person until their brain has started to slow down and their cortex is starting to come online. Now, if you're the person that's having the panic attack, I could tell you right now, pay attention to this stuff, but you're not going to because you're having a panic attack. So your brain's going to be offline, which is why it's really important prior to having a panic attack and thinking about it, when you're in an okay state and you're not in a state where you're about to potentially going in to have a panic attack, you might be talking with people that are in your direct system about this. Of, hey, if I have a panic attack, here's what it looks like, and can we game plan a little bit how to get me through it? The reason that you're doing that is because then you know that there's a safety net if you do happen to have a panic attack. Your presence to that person may be particularly calming because that person knows how to respond. When I'm with you, I know that if I panic, I know that you know how to handle this. And for some people, the expectation that it will be handled if it happens is enough to mitigate the chance that it's going to happen. But this requires a significant amount of trust in the person or the people that you're with that they can handle this. Which again is why if you're a person, so if you're sitting here asking yourself, oh my God, what would I do if I was in a space to help a person with a panic attack? If you yourself panic, you're going to make it worse. You're going to ping pong off of each other. And it's going to get really nasty. And so a lot of times when I'm working with people around panic attacks, once we've recognized the trigger and what their response is, I then work with the system of here's what you can do, and we practice that while the person's not having a panic attack so that they can see what it feels like. So those of you that were sitting in chat saying, wow, this is actually really calming for me to even hear you do this right now, it's because we're doing it while we're not panicking. And so you can feel what that's like. And if you know that that can happen and you can trust the people around you to assist you, and then you can eventually trust yourself to self-soothe, that's going to break some of this precursor worry that could potentially lead to being triggered. So the last part of what I'm going to do here before I move to questions, kind of the last part that I had prepared, just how to be prepared and some other techniques that you can use to try to prevent a panic attack or help somebody who's having a panic attack. The first one is have a plan. Is this. If I have a panic attack, what will I do? How will I talk to myself and recognize my state of arousal? How will I recognize my triggers? What are they? What does my own physiological response look like? Do I go catatonic or do I start to panic and hyperventilate? What is the cognitive spiral that I tend to send myself into? And then what we're going to do is we're going to plan for what the alternative self-talk is, and we're going to plan for how we acknowledge, and we're going to plan for how we're going to disrupt the feedback loop. I have had people write it down, what they're going to do, and they keep it in a place where they basically practice having a habit of grabbing, say, hold on, I'll show you guys actually a really cool example. Give me 1 second. I'm going to show you an example. So something that I have encouraged clients to do and have done myself, like I said, I'm not prone to panic attacks, but something that you can do is make sure that you have your plan in place with something that's meaningful. So my wallet is literally always with me, 100% of the time. Okay, so except for right now when I needed to go get it. But generally when I'm out and I'm not at home, my wallet is with me. So I have had people create something where you can actually create these custom cards on Amazon, which is really cool. They're like these metal cards, where in my wallet, it's a piece of metal that's really cool, so it's easy to feel. I can pull out this card, which on the back of it has some writing. On this card is a note that my fiance wrote for me. But we could pretend that it's got a panic attack plan on it. And I can pull that out when I'm in a state of arousal or triggered and have tangibly the plan with me. So it's basically the expectation with me. Whatever type of self-talk I need, whatever I know it is that's going to help disrupt the feedback loop, all of that on this card in a place that is very accessible to me. Now, the risk you run is that you could potentially become panicky if you forget your wallet. I've had people write something on their hand every morning when they wake up for a while. But yes, physical affirmation. I grab this, I hold it, so I have selective focus in my hand, and I have selective focus on now I'm reading this plan. And that in of itself can disrupt the feedback loop. So that's getting into just as quickly as possible. This is part of my plan, is to pull this out of my wallet. And yeah, I'm with you on that, Llama. So that's one example of something that you can do to plan for it. Okay, but have a plan and make sure that the plan is accessible. The second one is and this goes with what I just did, is find something to focus on. So figure out in the moment what it is that you are going to then selectively focus on. Is it going to be my feet on the floor? Is it going to be the thing in my wallet? In some of the work that I've done with esports athletes, for anybody who's curious on this one, when a esports athlete, if they're using a controller, starts to get, or a keyboard starts to get tilty, selectively focusing on the controller can actually be really helpful. Thinking about the actual motor movements on the controller as part of what you're doing in the game can be really useful. When I get tilted, I'm going to take 5 seconds and I'm going to pay attention to the controller. If it's while I'm respawning or whatever it is, that type of thing can be really helpful. But find something to focus on in the moment, right? Because what we do is we get into this space where we start to attend to the spiral. So we want to get out of here. And you have to relearn this stuff, guys. So you cannot expect to just talk about this and then it be better when you have a panic attack. So if any of you are sitting here right now thinking to yourself, oh, thank God I watched this because next time I have a panic attack, I'll be fine. No, you won't. You actually have to practice this stuff while you're not panicking. And then when you start to panic, you will have already felt yourself do it. So that's why I say to you guys, if you're going to engage in alternative self-talk, say it out loud. Hear yourself say it. know what it sounds like when it's in your voice. But you've got to practice this stuff while not panicking. So if I said, all right, I'm going to imagine for a second what it would be like if I started to freak out. Okay, so what I would do is I would take my wallet out, I would grab this card, I would grab it, and I would look at it, and I'm going to read it right now. Okay. And so what is that going to tell me to do? That's going to tell me to take some deep breaths. It's going to tell me to do some progressive muscle relaxation, which are two of the things I'm going to write right now. Breath is one of the ways that you can regulate your sympathetic and parasympathetic nervous system. So you want to go in through the nose, out through the mouth, and you want to hold for a little while. So everybody with, so what you're going to do is if you're helping a person with a panic attack, you're going to be doing what I'm about to do. But if you're having the panic attack, then you're going to follow along. Or you're going to do this for yourself. So right now, with me, attend really quickly to your state of arousal. And then what I want you to do with me, because I'm here with you, and I'm here with the chat, and we're going to do a little bit of grounding right here, and we're going to know what this is like. So again, take a look at me. I know it's easy to look at this screen over here, but take a look at me really quick. I want you to look at me and focus on me right now. Pay only attention to what's on your screen with me on it. And look at me really quick, okay? What I want you to do, I have your attention? Okay, I have your attention. So what I want you to do with me, I want you to watch it and do this with me. We're gonna breathe together. We're gonna go in through our nose. We're gonna hold and go out through our mouth. So in through your nose, hold, out through your mouth. Now I know this might be hard for some of you, and that's okay. Do your best. You're doing your best. So again, in through your nose, out through your mouth. Okay, so I want you to just keep doing that while you're with me. Just really focus on in through your nose and out through your mouth. And you're selectively focusing on that. And I'm sure the eye contact with me might be distressing to some of you, and that's okay. But if you were having a panic attack, making eye contact with you would be very important, because it would grab you. Even if it makes you somewhat anxious, it would grab you. All right, so now check in for a second. So I just had you do 4 breaths. If you did those breaths with me, check in with how your body feels. I know I feel somewhat more settled than I did even a minute ago, and that's because you've just engaged your parasympathetic nervous system. On my keychain, I have a Lego Boba Fett that if I start to feel antsy or anxious, I will grab and kind of hold on to. Yeah, if you have asthma, I can see how that would suck. So in that case, breathing may not be helpful for you, because I've said this before, but I'll say this now, you can actually induce a panic attack through hyperventilation. Like do not do this with me, okay? Do not do this with me right now. But if I was going to sit here and go, if I did that long enough, it will induce a panic attack. It's actually really scary. So if you're a person that's actually weird. So I can actually feel myself getting lightheaded doing that. It was pretty trippy. So you don't want to be in that state. The other thing that we can do, especially if breathing is hard, is we can do what's called progressive muscle relaxation, also called PMR. So progressive muscle relaxation is a chance for you to pay attention and selectively focus to your body and have some control over your body. So if you feel so inclined, and if you're able, you don't have to, you're under no obligation to do this with me if you don't want to, we're going to do some progressive muscle relaxation. There's a couple steps to this. The first thing you want to do is you want to try to sit or be in as comfortable of a state as you possibly can. Progressive muscle relaxation, by the way, is most useful before you feel the panic attack coming on. If you start to notice that you're in a heightened state of arousal, it can be really useful to do this, okay? So if you have an ability to get somewhat comfortable in your chair, take a second and do that. And the first thing that you want to do is just kind of pay attention to your breath, and you want to breathe as regularly as you can, but I know this is hard for some people, and that's okay. So what we're going to do with progressive muscle relaxation is you're going to start with your extremities. You're going to start with your fine motor muscles, which are in your hand. And so what you're going to do is tighten. If you got your hands able to do this, you can do it with your hands. Some people prefer to do it with their feet and legs, or you can do it with both. So take a second, if you're with me, okay, and tighten your fists. And while your fists are tightened, you can do one of two things. You can count to 5 or 10, or you can count how many breaths you're going to do while you're tightened. So I'm going to tighten and then do 5 breaths. Okay, so 1, 2, 3, 4, and then release. And then count for how many you're going to release. And it's really important to feel the release. 1, 2, 3, 4. And then now what we're going to do is we're going to tighten. We're going to get closer to our gross muscles. So we're going to tighten our arms. I'm going to tighten my arms or my legs, and I'm going to go 1, 2, 3, 4. And then I'm going to release. You could do both merely. It's up to you. But breathing with it can be really helpful. 1, 2, 3. And now I'm going to tighten my big muscles. So I'm going to tighten my shoulders. I'm going to tighten my chest. And again, you're not doing this while you're having a panic attack. You're doing this when you feel yourself in a heightened state of arousal. Doing it with the breathing. And then I'm going to release. 1, 2. It's actually very similar, Llama. And Crazy Pally, I appreciate your kind words. And I appreciate you being here. All right. So you continue to do this and work through different muscle groups, and you can do it for as long as you want, but you make sure that you're doing the breathing with it. But the important part, a lot of people pay a lot of attention to the tightening, but you also want to pay just as much attention to the release. And this is another reason why it's really important to understand your arousal and where you carry it. Because as I've said many times on stream, I carry my anxiety in my eyes. So if I rub my eyes a lot, it's a tell. So anytime you guys are watching me stream, if you ever see me rub my eyes like this, it's probably because I'm experiencing some kind of anxiety or stress. It's important for me to know that. Because if I notice myself rubbing my eyes, that tells me I'm probably in a heightened state of arousal. All right, so again, to sum up, have a plan, find an object to focus on your breath, and focus on your body. Big piece of panic attacks and how we work through panic attacks is changing our expectations and practicing how we're going to navigate an anxious space, and knowing that we have a plan, because knowing that you have an expectation of extinction can be really helpful. To know that you're going to be okay, to know that you're going to make it through a panic attack. And I would say that the last piece of this, by the way, if all fails, just really quickly, if all else fails and you have the panic attack, first of all, know that it's only going to last probably a max of 20 minutes because your brain just can't stay aroused that long. You'll shut down. It will extinguish. When it extinguishes, reinforce that it extinguished and pay attention to it. When the panic attack extinguishes, even if you have it, pay attention to the fact that it did extinguish, because that will bring you back to altering your expectations of what's going to happen next time. Because a lot of times what happens is a person has a panic attack and they freak out because they think it's never going to end. So if you can pay attention to the fact that it did subside, even if it sucked, that's really, really, really important to do, because then that builds a level of expectation. So again, in sum, panic attacks are positive feedback loops. And what we want to do is put blockers in the loop. And if you stretched this out, like if you pulled this apart and we looked at it this way, it just means we have to figure out at any given point, where can we put blockers to disrupt that feedback loop? And your expectations are going to be a big piece of what allows you to navigate this successfully. And again, I say that from my own kind of experience as a therapist who works with people who have anxiety and panic.